Our guest is the acclaimed and award-winning British author Esther Freud. Her new novel, I Couldn't Love You More, is, like much of her writing, deeply autobiographical. Her first novel, Hideous Kinky, drew on Esther's unconventional childhood, growing up in Morocco, and was adapted into a movie starring Kate Winslet. I Couldn't Love You More tells the stories of 3 generations of women, lighting upon what could have been Esther's own fate, narrowly escaping Ireland's cruel mother and baby homes, had her mother not taken great pains to avoid them. On her paternal side, Esther's family line includes the founder of modern psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. He's her great-grandfather. Her father, Lucian Freud, was the celebrated 20th century portrait artist who Esther would sit for. Also in the family album are journalists, designers and politicians. Lucian Freud and her mother, Bernadine Coverley, are fictionalised here in an account of bringing up babies outside of wedlock in County Cork in Ireland in the not-so-swinging 1960s. Esther's with us from London, where it's a very late midsummer's night. So thank you, Esther, and welcome to 9 to Noon.
Thanks for having me on.
Could you introduce us, please, to our 3 leading ladies, we put it that way, Aoife, Rosaleen and Kate?
Certainly. Well, I started this novel with the idea that I really wanted to write about love from the points of view of 3 different women from 3 different generations. I wanted to really look at the love that they had in their own relationships, and also that the love that they had for their own children and mothers, and the way all these different relationships kind of affected the other ones. So that was my starting point, and I very freely began to write the beginnings of some of their relationships, the sticky middle parts, and sometimes the end. And that led me into really looking very deeply at my mother's experience. So I'll start by introducing Rosaleen, who is based initially on my mother, who was, as you said in your introduction, came of age in the early 60s. She came from an Irish Catholic family, but she was a sort of new woman of that new post-war era. And she loved to go to clubs and to go dancing and to mingle with artists and painters and poets. And she met the sculptor, the refugee emigre glamorous sculptor Felix Lichtmann, who, as you've already said, was based in part on my own father. So this is Rosaleen. Her mother was a very ambitious, hardworking Irish girl who was the first in her family to leave Ireland. And she had many brothers, and they all came to London to make a better life for themselves. And she wanted nothing more than for her 3 daughters, and Rosaleen is the oldest, to not have the hard manual work in their life that she had had. And so they were educated well, and she hoped for great things for them. The 3rd character we have is Kate. And Kate is, at first, maybe for some readers, a little bit mysterious. How does she fit into the rest of this family? But it's not too difficult to work out that she is the child of Rosaleen. And she has been adopted, and we follow her story. And as we follow Rosaleen's story, we want to know why it was that Rosaleen had to give up Kate. And Kate is really the one who propels the story along, because she is searching for her mother in order to really find out who she is.
Begin the Begin, which we just played there, apart from being very evocative of a time and a place, and goodness, the novel is evocative, its significance is that this is where Aoife meets Cashel and they dance. And we can all imagine it, can't we? You say this is a novel of love. It's about the complications of love too, is it not?
Very much. I mean, where there is love, there is also complications. I hope that there's someone out there who doesn't feel that way, but for most of us, that's the case.
The real sense of Ireland here, and the Irish voice in the dialogue and in the whole rhythm and pace of the novel, is it something known innately through your family history and experience, or was it also the result of research and travel? How did you capture not just London, but Ireland and the dialogue of the time? Well,
it was a bit of both. My my mother's mother was from County Cork, and once it was quite a long time before I met my grandparents, because my mother decided to keep both her children, me and my older sister, secret from her parents when she had us, because she was so fearful at that time that that it would not be suitable, and that she didn't think necessarily that her parents would go to such lengths as to organize that her children were taken away and that she would go into a mother and baby home. But she was fearful that if somehow the priest, that was the local family priest, got involved, she decided it was safest to keep it a secret. So I didn't meet my grandparents till I was 6, but once we became friendly, and they were very loving and open-hearted to us once they came to know us, we spent a lot of our holidays in Ireland. And that really stayed with me, that farming life that they had, and the rhythm of their voices. I have a very good memory for these childhood events and sort of images, visual images. But I also went back to Ireland when I was writing this book quite a few times and really immersed myself in the countryside. I did a lot of research, as you can imagine, on the mother and baby home, which is not something that my mother ever experienced, but I wanted to tell a story bigger than my own story.
I want to come more to that because of the shocking things we have learnt in recent years, ever more shocking things we have learnt about what happened to those girls and young women and to their babies. But there is a strong, as we said, a strong autobiographical starting point, at least for much of this story. In the French pub in Soho, where Rosaline meets her artist boyfriend Felix Lichtman, does this again resemble how your parents met? And young, they were in their teens, or certainly your mum was a teen at the time, or is there poetic licence there?
Well, I never was able to really find out from my parents where they met and how they met, but I always imagined that they met in the French pub, which was somewhere that I used to often go in my late teens myself, and it still had the whole sort of residue of that bohemian world, and some of those people were still going at that point. Francis Bacon, or you would see Geoffrey Bernard, these sort of real Soho characters. But actually, the wonderful thing about writing a book is often the questions that you put out there in order to form the story come back as answers. So I actually had, through my website, a message from someone just the other day saying, my mother was with your mother when she met your father, and it was actually in a club called the Cave de France. I'd never heard of it. It wasn't in the French pub at all. So there you go. It was poetic license.
It's almost crowdsourcing these days, isn't it? The way we can get information, as you say, by putting the question out there. That is delightful. It's the London part of the story as well, the 1960s. It's a time of smoke and mirrors, isn't it? One of Felix's friends, Anastasia, is really called Phyllis, but changed her name to change that of her boyfriend's first wife. Is this, as you say, bohemian environment of the era just so rich to draw on as well as having been, the experience of your parents and indeed of yourself, full of rich characters?
Yeah. I guess I was sort of picking up little stories that I'd heard and throwing them in and mixing them up with a kind of fictional story. And I read quite a lot around the time. And obviously I knew a little bit and then read some and invented some and kind of mixed it all up and just hoped that it would ring true. I really enjoyed that section of the book. I really enjoyed writing those scenes. Certainly when I guess because my mother had me and my sister when she was very young, my own, coming of age, it was really only ever about 20 years later than hers. So the worlds hadn't changed so much, so I could kind of imagine myself in her world.
And what of her, portrayed through the character of Rosaline, or at least as a starting point, right? I think both your parents have passed now, and yes. you are in a stage of life, no doubt, of, as we do as we get older, coming back to wanting to understand them more and wanting to know more. And what do you understand of this young, 17-year-old who meets this to become famous artist and is in this whirl of a life? and falls pregnant. What do you, writing about this and reflecting of this now, understand about her?
Well, I felt always very sympathetic to my mother and very understanding of her predicaments, because it was almost like we grew up together to some extent. But one of the wonderful things about writing a novel where you choose a kind of episode of life or something or other that you're interested in is you get to pay it a lot of attention. And I was able to really imagine what it might have been like for my mother, but also the character of Rosaline that kind of grew out of her, what it was like for her as a really someone with a real life force who's been starved of oxygen by being born in the war with all the privations and the rationing and the smallness of life and the fearfulness of people that she lives among. And then she kind of comes of age just as the world is bursting into colour. And she meets this larger than life character. And I know that my mother herself felt that meeting my father really woke her up, and that she was absolutely dazzled by someone, who always, right to the end, was a huge life force. And so I wanted to create a real, true love story, not just a sort of, he took advantage of this young girl, he was older than her, and etc. No, I wanted to create a real love story, which I believed that my parents did share. But also, for the sake of the book, I wanted to write about love in different forms. And I wanted the one at the heart of the book to be a love story, even if it has, as anyone will read, huge complications that leave ultimately Rosaline utterly alone and in need of help. And sadly, she turns back to her own Catholic faith for the help that sends her into a very, very dark place.
I Couldn't Love You More, the title, the statement from lover to lover, can be read both ways, can't it? I couldn't possibly love you more, or actually I just couldn't love you more.
Yes, it wasn't originally the title of the book, but when I had finished a first draft, I gave it to somebody, a very wise and literary friend, and she picked out that line and said, it's really broke my heart. The double meaning is so poignant. And actually, I had written it as an expression of his deep love for her. But of course, I think I was just too involved. When you stand back, he has his limitations, as everyone has their limitations. And she said, that's a very good line. And I started to think, maybe that could be the title. And this book had many titles. And then it took me a while until I decided that this actually was the title for the book, and that it cast a whole extra shadow over the story.
Girls falling pregnant at this time in any of our countries, it is a, wherever it happened actually, it is a dark period in many ways. The separation, often unwanted, forced and brutal, of mother and child, with whatever intentions were behind the happening of it. But we were all familiar, of a girl or a young woman who disappeared and went north for a while and then came back. In your case, your mother disappears for a period of years, and this is this extraordinary story of what could have been. Does it haunt you still, what could have been for your life?
Well, not really, because my mother was in a very happy relationship when she had her first child, and was very protected by the fact that she was in love. And in a way, she was in a more vulnerable and dangerous position when she had me a few years later, when already her relationship with my father wasn't as secure. But by that time, she'd made friends with another woman, young teenage woman who had a baby, who was actually still my great, great friend. And they had formed a kind of support network and supported each other. And she'd become friends with all sorts of people who were already kind of living slightly on the outside of society. And I say that she had created her own new family. And the fact that she kept the secret from her family also kept her safe. Whereas Rosaline things start to break down while she is pregnant with her first child. So she's in a much more vulnerable position, and therefore she turns, as I've said, to the local priest, because girls at that time, especially Irish girls, were led to believe, and this carried on for many decades, that the church would help them. They would help them. They would find a way for them to safely have their baby. They might give them some money to buy a pram, or they would help them to find somewhere to live. They had no idea, so many of them, that actually they were being basically sort of drawn into a system where they would be enslaved, and that their babies, whether they wanted to give them up or not, would be adopted for quite some money, often to American Catholic married couples, and they would never see them again. And they made it, as we know from films like Philomena, very, very hard to ever trace their children.
Of your father, you are clear that there was a great love affair, a genuine love between them. But then we come to the point, I could not love you more. And how much did you, especially as a child and a young woman, have to do with your father, and how would you describe the relationship with Lucien?
Well, I don't have many memories of him before I was about 7. But from that point on, and that was partly because we spent some of those formative years living in Morocco, and we were totally, separated from anything in England, where he lived in London. But then he would sort of appear almost like a magical figure in our lives every so often. And he would come to visit us. Sometimes he would take us back to London, or we would travel to London and we would go to one of his exhibitions, or I don't know, do always something that felt a little bit outside and different from our normal lives. And he was a very powerful figure. He was he had the great, when people talk about charisma, it's a very ephemeral thing that some people possess, and he had it in spades. And he turned his attention on whoever he was turning them, and if it was a child, it would be just as powerful. So it was a matter of, I know this is a sort of rather unfashionable phrase now, but it was a matter of sort of quality, not quantity. We didn't see an awful lot of him, but when we did, it was very memorable and powerful. And then when I was about 16, I moved to London and I lived near him. And from that point on, I was extremely involved in his life. And those years were many, many more than the years that I wasn't. So I was in my late 40s when he died, and I probably saw him every week and spoke to him many times a week. And I sat for him for years and years. And yes, he turned out, against all the odds, to be the most wonderful father.
There are different ways of being a wonderful father, I guess, and people have to find what is possible for them. He seems, from some of what I have read, to have been fairly honest about the essential selfishness of the artist's life, which is quite refreshing. And what was your experiences of his strengths, I guess, and his weaknesses?
Well, he was very honest, and I think it's why he maintained such good relationships with many of the people in his lives, but particularly with the wives and lovers and ex-girlfriends, because he was honest. And I was very aware of this growing up. I kind of would watch. I was a very watchful child, and I would see the terrible fallings out of various friends of my mother's with their men, and it was always to do with deceit. Whereas my father was clear, he had to work, he couldn't live in a monogamous way. This is what he had to do, and he was clear about it. And, I'm not saying it was easy, but I think honesty has its benefits in those situations. And for me, watching his life, he certainly lived life to the full, but also he had an incredible work ethic. So it was very inspiring to see that he was extremely talented, but actually he said his talent was really just a small percentage of it. What it was the graft and the work and the application and the patience and the actual doing of the work. So when I started to write, it gave me a patience that maybe I might not have had in my 20s if I hadn't been a witness to how hard he worked.
That art is essentially, what is it they say, 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration, and that is true even of the very greatest of artists.
Yeah, yes, I think it's true, but I have to say I felt he had a little more than 10%.
10% true. Fair point. Esther Freud is our guest. I Couldn't Love You More is her latest novel, heavily autobiographical, in that it draws on family history, certainly as its starting point. It's 29 minutes past 10 on 9 to noon. When we have, as we do in real life, your mother leaving and having two children and being away from Ireland for, I think it was 5 or 6 years, was it not? And then coming back into the life of her parents in this, as we said, conservative, very Catholic country with the local priest just down the road. How does that happen? And how well does it go?
Well, my mother never did go back. You see, we would then visit for holidays, but my mother had made her life in England, and she mended certain things, but she was different from the rest of her family, that's for sure. And she just wanted different things, and she just had a different style of living, and she just was interested in completely different things to some extent, but there was a lot of love in the family, but she chose a different life. And so we got the benefit of spending time with our grandparents, and she got a little break at that point from looking after children. That's usually how it worked.
You see, now I'm starting to get the fact and the fiction confused, because was it someone who spotted your mother in London with children who then told your grandmother? I'm beginning to confuse the novel and real life.
That is really the problem. And some writers are very, very cagey about ever saying anything at all about the inspiration or the basis of their work. And they just let the book speak for themselves. I find it almost impossible and irresistible not to say, listen, this is how I began this story. I was so interested in something really happened in my life, and out of it grew this other story. And even sometimes I get confused. I think, hang on, what's in the book and what's in my life? So yes, I wrote a piece about the fact that that my grandparents didn't know that their daughter had even had any children until a relative saw her and wrote a letter to Ireland saying, I didn't know that your daughter was married.
Goodness.
And of course, the news came out. But in fact, this doesn't come into the book at all, because she, they don't know what happened to Rosaleen, because she gets sucked into the mother and baby home. And whether or not they know or not, I don't want to give the story away, but this is really a big plot twist in the story about, what happens to girls in families like that. That in a way, the story is, like you said earlier, oh, she's gone off to work, or we don't see her at the moment because she's got a good job in London. And the family don't really know what happened to their daughters often. And some of these girls, they never leave their homes. There's always one or two, and I did quite a lot of research into this, who they become so institutionalized in the mother and baby homes that they just stay there. They stay there for decades and decades until they're old ladies themselves, because they've lost the faith that they had that anyone would be willing to see them ever again. They're so full of shame. I looked into all of these possibilities for Rosaleen, but there was also another possibility that I discovered, that if somebody has a relative or a friend who will come up with quite a lot of money, they can buy their freedom. So I had all these options in the novel. What's going to happen? Is Rosaleen going to stay there forever? Is she going to work her pay for 3 years, which was often what you had to do? You had to repay the nuns for the care that they gave you for 3 whole years, scrubbing floors, cleaning windows, working the farm, selling flowers. Or is someone going to come up with the £100, which is the equivalent of thousands of pounds today? Anyway, you have to read the book to find out what happens to her.
It is, of course, also a meditation on motherhood. Yes, love in all its forms, but on motherhood also. And it calls you to reflect. I mean, you had, as we said, an unorthodox upbringing. The the story that forms the basis of Hideous Kinky. But has it caused you, again in this reflective mode, to think about the different ways of being a mother and the different ways we relate to our mothers?
Yes, I really enjoyed that aspect of writing the book, having a chance to think how societally our mothering techniques have changed so much. So I thought about Aoife, who is the grandmother, and how, she is very ambitious for her daughters because she grew up on a rural farm working very, very hard. She saw her mother give birth to numerous children, an old lady by the time she was in her 40s. And she was a working woman, and she was in charge of her own finances, and she wanted something for her daughters. And then the next generation down, is the generation of my own mother, who has so many opportunities. Feminism is being born, equality is just beginning. So there's music and fashion and so many opportunities, which gave rise to my generation, which I look at through Kate's eyes. And I'm very aware of this, that my generation have so many more choices, but they have in so many ways chosen to become very, very focused on their children. And it's sort of come round in an interesting circle. So I really enjoyed writing Kate, who focuses maybe obsessively on her little girl, Freya, and she tries to do everything absolutely perfectly. And as we know, this never goes well. It's just too much of a pressure for everybody when each meal has to just be perfectly created and to look beautiful and to be nutritious, and every bedtime has to be singing and play and stories. And, I used to virtually stand on my head, to try and get my children to feel that they'd had enough of me by the end of the day. I looked at this with great interest.
Esther, thank you. And thank you again for being up so late to talk to us. And thank you for the book. Esther Freud, I Couldn't Love You More, is the book she has published. It is the latest of, goodness, a number of novels, short stories and plays also too, I think, in the Earth now.